Good morning, everyone. Morning. So welcome to the Tzu Global Symposium for Common Goodness. This is the lecture series part of this brand. And this is hosted by the Tzu Foundation, which is trying to use this event to raise awareness for the common issues that face humanity on a global scale. So we try to bring together thought leaders from different parts of the world where we can discuss these issues that are facing us and try to propose solutions. So it is my honor and pleasure to welcome you to the Tzu Foundation Zhongzheng Jingsi Hall this morning. And we are very privileged today to have a very special lecture and from a world-class speaker. I'm sure that you already know a lot about Professor Peter Singer, so I wouldn't be able to tell you more than what you probably already know, but we do have the honor of inviting Dharma Master Zhao Hui, who is a personal friend of Dr. Singer, and we are very pleased to invite her to the floor to introduce Professor Singer and his lecture to us today. Thank you, Professor and Venerable Zhao Hui.
喂，能不能麦克风大声一点，可以吗？刚才就听不太清楚 ，TED 的话听不太清楚。嗨 ，OK， Respected Professor Singer, distinguished guests, and dear Dharma sisters and brothers in Tzu. I would like to use Mandarin to give a short but exact speech to introduce my friends, Professor Peter Singer. 好，那所以下面呢，为了要简短的又准确的来介绍一下Singer教授，我用英文会比较流畅，因为这边反正有 interpretation 可以帮助大家理解。那么彼得辛格教授呢，他在全球的哲学界可以说是一个执其牛耳的人，也就是说是在顶峰的一位大哲学家。他之所以获得这样子的一个荣耀呢，并不是偶然的，因为他有非常敏锐的哲思，而且他为了这份他的哲学的思维的理念呢，他可以坚持到底，包括他用他的理论来支持行动，让行动影响这个世界。因此呢，在这个世界上，对这个人类有巨大影响力的哲学家其实并不多，但是他是非常难能可贵的一位。我相信历史也会记录下他对这个时代的影响力。早从1975年呢，他这个看到当代的工厂化的农场那些经济动物的苦难，以及在实验室里面那些实验动物的苦难，他就有很大的悲悯心，促使他用他的哲学的睿智写了一本书，这就是《Animal Liberation》。那么这本书呢，在当时立刻轰动世界，当然它也带来了很大很大的骂名，这是难免的，因为对于动物的福利、动物的福祉、动物的权利的重视，必然会削减庞大的产业利益，而且它是逆转了人类的以人类为中心的思考的惯性，所以它必然会引起广大社会的反击。但是我们可以看到，它不但是有很强大的悲悯心，而且它有很深刻的睿智，更重要的是，他有很强大的道德勇气。他坚持说对的话而做对的事，这当然导致他面对很大的压力跟困境。 但是你们可以看到他是非常自在的，他从来没有受到那些指责、那些攻击，乃至于那些抵制的任何影响。这个在我们这个时代里呢，也是另外一种类型，从另外一个角度看到他的典范。因此呢，这次我们很荣幸，因为我们关怀生命协会呢，在民国80年代大概是1994、95吧，我们就开始翻译他的新书，他的那本《Animal Liberation》。当时这个《动物解放》这本书一出来呢，就很受到学术界的重视，当然也有包括佛教界的关心。那么我们很荣幸的是，在那以后我们结下了这个缘分，所以这次是 Peter Singer 教授第4次来台。那么他来台呢，这次有一个重要的理由，就是他的 Animal Liberation Now， 也就是说，他当时写的《动物解放》呢，现在就行动现在所谓的《动物解放》现在就行动这本新书呢，可以说是他的 Animal Liberation 的一个定版。他经过多年的仔细修订，所以他提出了很多新的观点，包括面对新的生物科技，还有包括在人工智能的时代，我们要怎么去面对一些动物伦理的问题。所以这本新书已经不等于前面的 Animal Liberation。所以今天呢，大家来到这里呢，我看到很多这个朋友们都已经在购买这本新书。这本新书绝对非常的值得大家阅读那么就像是当年的那本书被当作动保圣经一样，今天它的 Animal Liberation Now 呢，依然在引领这个世界去思维非常前卫的一些问题。今天它的题目是这个与万物共生，当然这个是佛家最高的理想但是透过一个英美哲学的哲人来用效益主义的进入来告诉我们为什么要与万物共生？我们有没有可能与万物共生？我们应该怎么样才能够让我们与万物共生？这一系列的问题呢，其实都非常的重要所以呢，我们很期待聆听他的睿智的语言，来给我们更新的启发那所以呢，我的简介呢就到这里，谢谢。
Thank you, Venerable Zhao Hui. So we now have the pleasure of welcoming Professor Peter Singer to the podium.
Thank you very much. I want to thank everybody who's been involved in making this event possible from Tzu Chi. I want to thank Master Chao Wei for the invitation to come to Taiwan for this visit. And I also want to thank, of course, everyone who's been involved in producing the new version of Animal Liberation Now, in a traditional Chinese translation. What I want to talk about today, as you can see from the title behind me, is what it is to live an ethical life. And I regard living an ethical life as trying to do the most good that one can. So, as I think as Master Chao Wei just said, to me, living an ethical life involves being active in the world and trying to leave the world a better place for the fact that you have lived in it. So let me move to looking at some of the ways that I think are most important in living an ethical life. This is an outline of what I will be talking about. Just very briefly, I want to state why I think that ethics is a matter not of subjective feelings or opinions, as some people have believed, but of objective moral truths. Secondly, I will ask what we can do to help our fellow human beings, one important part of living ethically. and then I will ask what we can do to reduce the suffering of non-human animals. And finally, I will talk about some examples of living an ethical life. So, are there objective moral truths? The person you can see in the slide here is Derek Parfit, who was a philosopher at Oxford. When I went to Oxford as a graduate student in 1969, the classes that he conducted were some of the most stimulating that I have ever experienced in my lifetime. Unfortunately, he died about 6 years ago, I think. But this is a quote from the first volume of a very major work that he produced towards the end of his life, called On What Matters. And as you can see here, he's making a parallel between truths of mathematics. We grasp the truth that 1 + 1 = 2, and of course we also grasp much more complex mathematical truths. So just as we can see our reasoning enables us to understand these mathematical truths, so he believes that our reasoning leads us to grasp moral truths. In particular, the moral truth that if someone is in agony and I can relieve that agony, I have a reason to do so. This is not only a matter of my feelings or my empathy, but I can see that being in agony is a bad thing, an objectively bad thing, and if I can prevent it, I have a reason to prevent it. As he says, not necessarily a conclusive reason. There might be other reasons going the other way in particular circumstances, it's possible at least, but certainly a reason. And so we have to look at the various reasons that we have for acting, and we may think of those reasons as trying to prevent suffering and, where possible, also trying to increase happiness. So I won't say more about that now. Obviously, this is a very short statement of a very large topic, but I'm just outlining it so you can see where I stand on this fundamental question about ethics. So let me move then to the next more practical question. What can we do to help our fellow human beings? And I will start with something that I wrote about more than 50 years ago in an article called Famine, Affluence and Morality. I asked my readers in that article to imagine that they are walking across a park, and in that park there is a pond, an ornamental pond, which is quite shallow. They know it's quite shallow. And usually, of course, there was nobody in the pond, but they see something splashing in the pond, and you realize that it is actually a small child who has fallen into the pond. And although the pond is shallow, it is too deep for this small child to stand. So the child appears to be drowning. Now, perhaps the first thought you would have is, this child is too small to be alone. Who is looking after this child? There must be a mother or father or a babysitter, but you can't see anybody. You don't know why, but there is only you and the child around the pond at this moment. So what should you do? Well, perhaps you think, obviously, you should jump into the pond and save the child. And I think that is the right answer. But I think it's the right answer even if there is some cost to you to do this. So the cost, I imagine in the story, is that you're going somewhere important and you've put on your best clothes. They're quite expensive, your very expensive shoes, for example, and they will be ruined if you jump into this pond and you don't have time to take them off. But even if that is the situation, I hope you would think a child's life is at stake. Replacing my shoes or my trousers or dress, whatever it might be, is trivial compared to a child's life. And after all, there is no risk to my life. The pond is shallow. I know I can stand up. So I must save the child. And I think that's clearly the right answer. But if that's the right answer in that situation, then I think we have to ask ourselves a question, not about this hypothetical example, which will probably never happen to you, of having the opportunity to save a child at the cost of ruining your expensive shoes, but rather look at the real world today. And the world we live in today is one in which children are dying and we can help them. So these are figures from UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Foundation. In 2023, the most recent year for which we have figures, 4.8 million children died, and most of those deaths were from preventable causes. Not all, of course, but most of those children died because they were not getting enough to eat, or they did not have safe drinking water, or they got bitten by mosquitoes carrying malaria, and they were not sleeping under any nets to prevent the mosquitoes biting them, or they were not vaccinated against common diseases. There are many causes why children under 5 die, but most of those causes are preventable. So think about that and ask yourself, could I contribute to reducing those deaths? Well, I think the answer is yes, but I also think it's important to think about how best we can do this. So the person you're seeing here is called Toby Ord. He's now a professor at the University of Oxford in philosophy. But at the time I'm talking about now, he was only a graduate student at Oxford. But he was interested, he had read the article I mentioned that I wrote, Famine, Affluence and Morality, and he was interested in this idea that we can save lives. And he wondered how he could best save lives. And he did an unusual calculation. He tried to calculate how much he was going to earn over the rest of his life until retirement if, as he hoped, he would become an academic, a professor at some stage, and so he could calculate roughly how much he would earn, and then he wanted to calculate how much he would need to live on if he lived modestly. So he was then on a scholarship. As a graduate student, he was on a scholarship, and he thought, well, I can live quite well on this scholarship, but I expect I could use a bit more, so he added another, I think, £2,000 or £3,000 a year to the cost of his scholarship, to what he was getting on the scholarship, and he said, I could live quite comfortably on that. And so then he deducted that for each year up to his retirement. He deducted that from what he expected to earn. And of course, he was left with quite a large sum. And then he asked himself, how much good could I do with this sum? And what charity should I donate it to? So he considered many charities, but I'm going to mention just 2 of them. One is to donate to an organization that trains guide dogs for people who can't see well, people who are blind or visually impaired. Now that's a good charity in a way. It's good to help people who are blind to get around with a dog, with the help of a dog, and they usually love and care for the dog well. So that's a good thing to do, but it's also actually quite an expensive thing to do. For each person who gets a guide dog, somebody has to train the dog over many hours and also has to train the person to work with the dog. And because that's a skilled work, you have to pay that person. So at least in the United States or the United Kingdom, or the cost of that is about 40,000 US dollars for one guide dog for one person. Compare that with preventing blindness by treating trachoma. Trachoma is the major cause of preventable blindness. It's a microorganism that gets in the eyes of children, particularly in countries where it's hot and dusty. You can think about North Africa, for example, and where levels of hygiene are not very high. But it's very cheap to prevent blindness. You set up clinics, you wash the eyes of the children with something that kills the microorganism, and they don't become blind. And one study that Toby Ord read suggested that it cost as little as $25 to prevent a case of blindness. Now, that figure is now out of date, I'm sure. Maybe it costs significantly more. Say it costs $100 to prevent a case of blindness. Well, it's still the case that you could either train one guide dog for one person, or you could prevent 400 people becoming blind. So that's a good example of how important it is to find the most effective charities, the ones that will do the most good if you donate to them. So Toby decided at this stage to recommend to people that they should donate to the most effective charities they can find, and set up an organization called Giving What We Can to do that. I've set up another organization which does a similar kind of research focused on extreme poverty. It's called The Life You Can Save. You can find it online at thelifeyoucansave.org. And it does the research to find the best and most effective charities with the highest impact. So it suggests that people donate to these highly effective charities. And if you go to the website, you can see that you can look at the research there, over there, and you can look at the best charities. So what we're trying to do is to make more people aware of the importance of giving and how effectively you can give and save lives by giving to effective charities. And here's one of the examples of one of the top-ranked charities from The Life You Can Save, and also by other organization, GiveWell. It's distributing bed nets against malaria. What these children and adults are carrying in the blue bags are nets that prevent malaria-carrying mosquitoes from biting people sleeping under the nets. And it's particularly important for children because most of the deaths caused by malaria are deaths in children. They have the least resistance. But of course, for adults too, it's a very nasty disease. I happen to have had malaria when I was much younger after spending some time in New Guinea. So it's a good thing to distribute bed nets, and it's a cheap, relatively inexpensive way of saving a life. It costs around $4,500. You can compare that with what we spend on medical care to keep people alive in advanced countries, which very often is hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars to save a life. So I think that's one important thing that we can do, to donate some of our surplus that we have to effective charities. Let me move on to asking what we can do to reduce the suffering of non-human animals. And I know that I'm speaking here to a Buddhist organization, and one that is concerned about reducing the suffering of animals, as of course is LCA, the organization with which Master Chow Wei is involved. So, to me, perhaps the most important way we can live ethically in regard to animals is by trying to eat ethically. And this is I think, the single most important way in which we can help animals because of the numbers involved. So we can think about another concern we have about animals is the number of animals killed annually in research. It's approximately 200 million. That's an estimate because not all countries publish good figures on that question. But if we compare that with the number of animals we raise and kill annually for food, we can see that it is 1,000 times as large. It's about 200 billion rather than 200 million. And this is just animals who we are raising, so it does not include wild-caught fish whose lives are free in the ocean, although catching and killing them almost always involves intense suffering. But it does include fish raised in aquaculture, which I will talk about shortly. So that's why this is such a big problem. It's, I think, the largest area of suffering where we inflict suffering on non-human animals. And the suffering is really quite severe. This is a photo of how chickens are raised for meat. So this is the overwhelming majority of chickens sold worldwide now for meat are raised like this. In the United States, 99.8% of chickens sold come from intensive production. It's hard to call them farms like this. This is something like there may be 10,000, there may even be 20,000 birds crammed into a shed. They never go outside, of course. So the first thing that you can see and that is obvious about their suffering is the crowding, the overcrowding. But there's more that you actually can't see in this slide. There's more suffering. And one of the reasons why Professor John Webster, who is quoted here, who is a veterinarian and the founder of a Center for the Study of Farmed Animal Welfare in the United Kingdom, he thinks this is the worst thing we do to animals, not only because of the crowding, but also because we have bred these chickens to grow very quickly. We have selected them for the fastest growing chickens to have great appetites, to want to eat all the time, and to put on weight very fast. And in that way, they are very quickly ready for market. At only about 6 or 7 weeks of age, they will be taken out of the shed, put on trucks, and taken to slaughter. Now, why is this a problem? It's a problem because their huge body weight for their age means that their legs struggle to bear the weight. Professor Webster has compared this with somebody who has arthritis in their legs, having to stand up all day. And so he thinks that as they grow older, for at least the last 2 weeks of their lives, they are in pain just standing up and walking around. And sometimes their legs will collapse under them. Sometimes their legs will fail to bear the weight and they will not be able to walk. They will just have to sit on the, it's actually, you can't see it here, but it's kind of, usually it's called litter, like wood shavings or something like that they're standing on. They will have to sit on that and then they can't move. Now what you're seeing here is, this is how they get water and food down these lines or pipes. So if this bird here can't walk, that bird will starve to death or die of dehydration. And that happens to roughly 5% of the birds in a shed like this each time. The producers acknowledge that mortality is around 5%, even though they're very young birds. And if you think about the numbers, something like 70 billion birds are reared worldwide in this manner. 5% of that is still a very large sum. it's something like, what, 3.5 billion birds a year dying slowly in this manner. So that's one reason why this is causing suffering. I can look at some of the other forms of factory farming. This is egg production. This is actually egg production in mainland China, where you see, but it's pretty standard. I think I've got another slide. You see the rows of cages. The birds in these cages for their entire egg-laying lives. Once they are old enough to start laying eggs, they are put into the cages, and they stay there until their rate of laying eggs falls away, starts to decline, and then they are taken out to be slaughtered. So, do I have another photo here? Yeah, so this is what the birds look like by the end of the lay, usually. Their feathers have been rubbed off because they're so crowded against the wire. Sometimes they've been pecked at by other birds. This is an extremely lucky hen who was rescued from one of these farms and put out on grass. Now you might think that because the hens have been inside all their lives, they have no instincts about catching insects in the grass or other things like that hens will normally do outside. But that's mistaken. They still have these instincts. So you take a bird who has never been outside like this, a rather miserable looking bird, and when she is ready to lay an egg, she will try to build a nest, or she will find somewhere with some straw or leaves and build a nest for the egg to lay in, which she could never do in the cage. She's just in a bare wire cage. She will flap her wings, she will dust bathe. Hens like to flip dust up under their wings. All of those instincts are still there, but they have been frustrated for the entire life of the hen in almost all of these cases. Pigs are also extremely crowded when they are produced, and I know China is the largest producer of pigs in the world, and in Taiwan I've already noticed walking around some of the villages that there are a lot of pig and pork products being sold, but virtually all of these pig products will again come from factory farmed pigs, crowded together like this, and in particular their mothers, the breeding sows, are very often kept in this way, just in narrow stalls. These are essentially breeding machines. They are pregnant almost their entire lives. That's their role. Once they're old enough to become pregnant, they are inseminated, or in some places put together with a boar. But then as soon as they're pregnant, they're put in stalls like this, where they can't even turn around. They can only stand up and lie down. They can't even really stretch very well. You can see that maybe you can see the legs of this sow actually protrude through the bars onto that one. There isn't really room for them to lie properly. So their lives are even worse than that of their offspring. When they're pregnant, when they give birth, they are also confined in this way. Again, just on bare metal. They can't. Pigs also will build a kind of a nest in the wild. In their forest animals, they will get leaves together and they will build a little nest before they give birth for themselves and their piglets. But that's too labor intensive to give them straw to bed in. It costs money, so typically producers don't do that. They just restrain them like this to make sure they don't roll over on top of any of the piglets. And they're like a milking machine, really, to give milk to the piglets. But the piglets will be taken away at about 3 weeks of age, and they will be made pregnant again, and they will go through the same cycle. And this too is happening on a huge scale in China. This is a photo of one of the enormous pig factories that China has built. These are the sow stalls, huge numbers of them. But this is just one floor of a multi-story building. China has built 26-story pig factories with pigs on every floor who never go outside or get to walk around. So that's the land-based mammals who are birds and mammals who are factory farmed in the largest numbers. But I do want to mention fish raised in what is called aquaculture, which is really just another form of factory farming, crowding fish together in huge numbers, again with no real concern for the individual animals, each of whom is a sentient vertebrate animal capable of suffering and feeling pain, but for the producers they are simply a commodity to be produced. So in all of these forms of animal production, the animal welfare is not really considered. What is considered is how can we produce the product as cheaply as possible. And that's why I consider it an unethical way of producing food and something that we should not be participating in. I have more details in the new edition of Animal Liberation, and I hope you will look at that and find the details and the references for what I've been talking about. Okay, let me say a little bit now about some examples of people who are living a good life and what that involves, and also ways in which many people are not living a good life. First, though, I want to mention a website called 80,000 Hours. 80,000 is an estimate of the number of hours people spend in their career. So those of you who are teachers, I hope that you will think about recommending this website to your students, and any students here, I hope you will, if you're not already decided on your career, you'll look at it. Because this website exists to recommend careers on the basis of how you can contribute to a better world. And I think many career counseling organizations just will tell you how you can live in a way that will make you well off, comfortable, financially okay. But I think for many people it's important that they do think about their career as something that is meaningful, that is contributing to a better world. And this website gives advice on how you can do that. Now, what is a successful life? These are some expensive brands that try to sell to us, and many people will take from this the idea that you are successful if you can afford these products, if you can afford the expensive luxury brand cars or perfumes or speedboats or whatever else it might be. We have become a society in which brands are excessively important. And I think that we need to try to turn away from this. We need to try to educate younger people that these are not the things that really matter in life. These are not the marks of success. These are rather something that has been foisted upon us by companies that want to profit from our purchases. This is not wise advice. This is self-interested propaganda from the companies that produce these products. And in fact, when people do swallow this propaganda and think about trying to achieve success in those terms, psychologists have shown that they are on what they call a hedonic treadmill. Hedonic from the Greek word for pleasure. They're on a treadmill because they're constantly trying to improve their level of consumption. They're buying these expensive products that I showed you in the previous slide. And although that might bring them pleasure in the short term, that pleasure does not last. That happiness does not last. It's not a form of fulfillment. So they have to keep running. They have to keep trying to earn more money to find still higher levels of consumption, which they hope will eventually bring them fulfillment. But it never does. And I know that, again, I'm speaking to a Buddhist organization, and I think this is something that is very much in harmony with Buddhist teachings, that modern studies in psychology have also shown to be true, that attachment to material things is not the way to happiness, and particularly to more and more consumption of material things, which also, of course, causes the environmental crisis that we face because we demand to live at such a high level of consumption that it demands a lot of energy and a lot of resources to satisfy. So, how can we get off this hedonic treadmill? Well, I want to give you a couple of examples. This man, Henry Spira, I met in 1974 when I was a visiting assistant professor at New York University, and I was writing Animal Liberation, and the university invited me to teach a course for adults, not for the usual students at New York University, but they have an adult education or continuing education department. As I was writing Animal Liberation, I used this course to get some feedback on the early drafts of the book. And one of the people who came to this course was this man, Henry Spira. As you can see here, I mean, he wasn't exactly dressed like this, but he's a fairly rough-looking guy. He had actually had a career in what you would call a working-class career. He'd worked in the General Motors automobile assembly line in New Jersey. He'd also been a merchant seaman working on ships. But shortly before this time, he had decided that he wanted to help educate young people in the poorer districts of New York, and he trained himself as a high school teacher, which is what he was doing then. But he came along to this course because he had seen an article that I had written, the first thing I wrote on animal liberation, which was an article in the New York Review of Books, just published in 1973, so just a year before this course. And Henry had always been on the side of the people who were oppressed, the working class people. He'd always been politically allied with those. He'd marched in the civil rights marches for blacks in the American South in the 1960s. And the article that he read had made him think that, in fact, maybe it was not only humans who are oppressed, but that we also oppress non-human animals, that they are actually the most oppressed group because they are voiceless, they can't organize against their oppression. So he was interested in what I had to say. And after the class, at the end of the class, he stood up and said, you know, I'd been talking about theory and describing, as I did today, factory farming. He said, well, this class was all very interesting and educational, but what are we going to do about it? He said, if anybody is interested in doing something about it, let's get together and meet. He suggested they meet in his New York apartment and we could talk about what to do. And several people in the class gave him their names and phone numbers, and he got them together. And after I left New York, because I then went back to Australia, to where I come from, to take a permanent teaching position. My position at New York University was just a temporary one. After that, he started organizing campaigns to help animals. And I won't go into details now, I don't have time, but I would say he was perhaps the most successful campaigner for animals in the last quarter of the 20th century. For example, he had a big campaign to get cosmetics companies to stop testing their products on animals. And he was largely successful in getting the big cosmetics companies to put money into developing alternatives to the use of animals so that they didn't have to test cosmetics on animals. in 1997, I think it was, he called me up when I was in Australia. We'd kept in contact. And I'd often said that I wanted to tell other people, I wanted to write something to tell other people about how he had been so successful in his campaign, because he had distinctive methods of campaigning that really worked. And he called me up and said, "Peter, do you still want to write that book about why I've been a successful campaigner?" And I said, "Yes, I do." And he said, "Well, I think you need to write it soon." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because I've been diagnosed with cancer, and it's the kind of cancer that they're not going to be able to cure. So if you want to do that, come and do it now. Come over to New York. I'll share my files with you and give you the material to write the book, even if I don't live to see it." So I did that, and this is the book. Fortunately, he did live to see it, although only by a couple of months. But he knew that his work would live on in that book, and he felt fulfilled by what he had done. This is the campaign he had against Revlon for cosmetics, to stop them blinding animals for beauty's sake. I won't go into, again, the details because I'm running out of time, but this is the message that he gave me when he knew that he was dying. And he was rather calm about this. He was not troubled or anxious as most people would be. And he said, I asked him why, right? Why was he so calm of this? And he said that he felt he'd lived his life well. He said, "I guess basically one wants to feel that one's life has amounted to more than just consuming products and generating garbage. One likes to look back and think that one's done the best one can to make this a better place for others. It's not a sense of duty, but rather this is what I want to do. I feel best when I'm doing it well." And I think that's an important message that we can all take about engagement in doing well. Whoops, sorry, I don't know what happened then. Just one more example. As I told you, I founded this organization, The Life You Can Save, but a lot of the work of setting it up was done by this man, Charlie Bressler. Charlie called me up out of the blue. He'd read the book, and he said, "Do you want help in setting up an organization that will spread these ideas?" And I said, "Yes, I would, but who are you?" And he told me that he'd had a very successful career in the men's clothing business. He was actually the president of a nationwide US chain of men's clothing stores. So he'd made quite a lot of money, but he somehow had the feeling that this was not really how he'd wanted his life to go. He had not really wanted just to make money by selling men lots of new suits. Rather, he wanted to do something more worthwhile. So when he read the book, he, and I say, helped to found the charity, did a lot of work in setting it up, all as a volunteer. He was never paid anything. In fact, he was an important donor to The Life You Can Save. But, as I say down the bottom, what he said was, "The first life I saved was my own," because he felt that he'd given his life a meaning that it had never had before. And finally, I want to mention Chao Wei, with whom I did this book, The Buddhist and the Ethicist, and I particularly value the fact that she is an engaged Buddhist, that she is not concerned only about achieving enlightenment for herself, which is a widespread image that people have of what Buddhists do, that they spend a lot of time meditating in order to achieve enlightenment. But I think the idea of engaged Buddhism is very closely parallel to what I've been talking about, to what is involved in living an ethical life. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Singer, for this very powerful and compassionate lecture. We now also have the honor of inviting two distinguished professors to give us their responses as inspired by Professor Singer's speech. First is Professor Tseng Guo-Fang. He is the director of the Medical Simulation Center at Tsinghua University. Please join me in welcoming Professor Tseng.
Good morning, everyone. Okay, I'm privileged to be invited here and to follow Professor Peter Singer's path, to talk a little bit about, be considerate to the well-being of all the livings, as well as the planet Earth that we live in. Okay, I would switch the gear a little bit on engagement Buddhism in medical education. What has been done by Tseng is very different from what was, originally practiced all around the world. Okay, Tseng originated in eastern Taiwan, an underprivileged area, geographically isolated from the resource-rich area of the islands, okay, by high mountains and also cliff-blocked coastlines. With the efforts, with the compassionate relief, establishment of the Compassionate Relief Foundation in 1966, Tseng started his medical mission with a small free clinic in Hualien, and later with some major efforts, the Tseng General Hospital in 1986, okay, to better serve the area. However, the organization came to realize that it faced another big problem because experienced medical professional doesn't want to work in this part of the island because it's underprivileged. So Tseng was forced into stepping into medical education. So it started with nursing college in 1989, and then in 1994, medical school, and now the Tseng University. Okay, so the aim of the university was to team up with the hospital to provide a medical infrastructure for the area to better serve the people. Okay. When we look at medical education or medicine, Western medicine started with the study of human bodies, like in this painting in Padua University in Italy. Okay. Gross anatomy dissection started in mid-1400s, okay, in temporary structures with executed criminals, the body from executed criminals, okay, and this approach has made Andrea Vesalius, and now looking upon as the father of modern anatomy, to publish the first anatomy atlas in 1543 based on convicted criminals sentenced to death, okay? And then with more and more people want to learn human anatomy, in 1595, a permanent 6-story structure was built in Padua University called Anatomical Theater for those who want to learn to observe the dissection in the center of the 4th floor at some great distance. Okay, every year this structure dissected 2 bodies, 1 male and 1 female, again convicted criminals. Okay, and so this is sort of the situation. It has been all along with the establishment of Western medicine. And ironically, if you look at the entrance of this anatomical theater, there's a motto, okay, in Latin, which I can read. But it literally means this is a place where death delights to hail the living, okay? But those bodies dissected, they didn't pledge their body for medical education, but the people with the privilege, to dissect them say that they are very happy to help being dissected and to help the other people. So this is kind of ironic to me, okay? So we inherited a trait of treating the dead human body as specimen. So we started by dissecting convicted criminals, and then later in Europe, by grape rob the body. We dig out the body from the grape and send it to medical schools for dissection, okay? And then later, in 1832, started in England, we dissect unclaimed bodies, okay? And that sort of operation has spread all around the world and also to Taiwan. So all the universities in Taiwan, medical schools in Taiwan, dissected unclaimed bodies. Okay, and nowadays, around 30 or 40, starting 30 or 40 years ago, there are some people, especially in the Western world, they are willing to donate their body. But still, the medical school treat the body as specimen, okay? They strip the names and all the relation attached to the body. They do de-ritualization, they emotionally detached, and ask the student just to dissect the body, learn the structure, and without any feeling, okay? That's our medical education. And to me, this is at odds with the goals of medical education and medicine, which is to train caring professionals and to provide holistic care to the patients. And actually, in 2010, Professor Patterson from Norway, he reviewed the medical education around the world, and this is his conclusion. There's a serious dichotomy of biomedical training and humanical training in the medical schools. And with the explosion of biomedical knowledges, humanity training has been reduced just like add-on in medical education. So this is the problem with the education. So Tzu Chi sees this differently. And Tzu Chi thinks that the ethics of anatomy should be more than just being legal. It should meet the moral standard of the society, to be considerate to others and everyone. Okay, so in Tzu Chi University, our medical students learn anatomy. We see a person. We dissect the body, but we see a person. We don't see it as a specimen. Okay, and okay, so we coined the silent mentor program, which is a program that meets the core value of medical education and medicine and societal expectation. So in our program, in Tzu Chi University established in 1994, it starts campaigning for wheeled body, which is against all odds in Taiwan, because before Tzu Chi University, there was no body donation whatsoever in Taiwan, okay? And all the body students used in Tzu Chi are donated bodies, okay? And we look upon the donor as silent mentor because they are silent teachers. They don't use their voice to teach. Instead, they offer their body to teach. And they are altruistic mentor or role model to the students and the teachers, and putting it together, silent mentor. And we design interactions for our students to accompany the surviving families through the last stretch of their loved one's life. And with the help of the Dharma master from the Jing board, we have rituals that families and students walk together through the last stretch of the person's life. Okay, and who donate the body in Tzu Chi? Actually, for instance, the three most senior Dharma masters from the Jing board, when they die, they donate their body. Their secular relatives living in the society, at the end of their life, they donate their bodies, okay? And the ordinary Tzu Chi volunteers, at the end of their life, for instance, the person in the middle died at the age of 46, and he was living a life just like in the right picture, you know, with very little. Still, she offered money to help the poor, and at the end of her life, she offered her body for medical education. And this is one example of a lady who wielded her husband's body for anatomy teaching. But her husband came from southern Taiwan. The family came from southern Taiwan. They were strongly against the body donation. They think that the wife was revenging, having her husband for cuts, okay? But even so difficult, when she turned around and faced the student, this is what she said. She said, I would rather have you make 20 practice cuts or my husband than to see you make any mistakes on patients. That's great courage. She's taking up all the pressures and are still willing to offer her husband's body to improve medical education and help future patients. Okay, so in the supplemental program, our students visit the family around 2 months before the dissection, get acquainted with the family, learn about the life of the person, why the person wants to donate the body. And for the families, they get to know the students, and so that they can anchor their feeling, and also they get direct feedback from the students. And at the beginning of the dissection, we invite all the family to the medical school, and students and families together to have the beginning rituals. And during the process, during the dissection courses, our way of showing the respect. And at the end of dissection, our students reshape the body, taking time to reshape the body by carefully suturing the skin and dress the body properly, and then invite the family back to the medical school and do the coffining. The next day, they send the body together for cremation. And while waiting for the cremation, we have gratitude ceremony. And in the late afternoon, when the cremation returned to the university, students and family together place the cremants in the crystal urn provided by the university and housed in the great given hall of the university. That's complete the whole process. So we started with gross anatomy once a year in 1996, like this. And then a few years later, with more and more donation, we create this surgery training program, okay? So the donated body will quick freeze to -30 and then salt for surgeons and or senior medical students to practice invasive surgical skills or surgery, okay? And nowadays, we have 9 programs each year for surgery training. So gross anatomy and surgery training, altogether 10 programs each year. But each program, we do the home visit all through the end to housing the cremants in the great given hall independently. Because for the family, their loved one will die only once, even though from the medical school side, it looks like it's a repetition 10 times a year. You know, it's a whole lot. So we started with this in Eastern Taiwan, and all those in Taiwan, all the other medicals in Taiwan look at Tzu Chi University as weirdo because we are doing things so strange, okay? And most of the pros came from overseas. For instance, in this case, a Wall Street journalist, Pulitzer Prize journalist called Ian Johnson, in 2009, in February, he learned about our operation, phoned us, and joined our operation at the end of February. And in April 22nd, he wrote up something in the front page and the back page of the university, in the journal. This is what he said. Even though Wall Street Journal is an economy-oriented newspaper, but many of the readers are medical professionals and medical educationists. And it is good what this university does. You know, it is good to introduce to the Western world. Professor Peter Cox from Oxford University came to our practice twice, and this is what he said. He said that Western medicine originates in the West and spread to East. But humanistic medical education arises from the East and back spread to the West. And this is a comment that supports us, you know, to do it continuously. So at the end, I would like to say that we add humanity to the conventionally very strict medical education, so that it can be more holistic and through the end of medical education and provide better care for future patients and a more harmonious world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Tseng, for adding a very valuable viewpoint as we talk about compassion and humanity today. So next, we are very pleased to welcome Professor Deng Weijen from the Dharma Drum Institute of Liberal Arts. He is the director of Buddhist studies there.
Forgot my mic. Professor Singer, venerable hosts and distinguished colleagues and friends, it's a true honor to respond to, well, in fact, it's more a learning experience, more to learn from Professor Singer's insightful presentation, which is not only intellectually stimulating, but more importantly, emotionally disturbing, sad, thinking that we humans are doing to the animals. Equal importantly, your insightful and pragmatic suggestion of how to live a good life, a life that dignifies ourselves and others, is something we can benefit from. I have heard a lot about Professor Singer from Venerable Zhao Hui and his intellectual exchange with Venerable Zhao Hui, and I have admired his pioneering work, which has decisively shaped global conversations about how we ought to live and how we can do most good and how we should regard suffering of non-human animals. I'm not a scholar of ethics, but a student that has strong desire to learn about it. I'm a scholar of Buddhist studies, and from a Buddhist standpoint, I'm especially grateful for his unwavering insistence that suffering matters. The Buddha's first noble truth is precisely that, the recognition of dukkha, suffering, dissatisfaction, vulnerability. In that sense, there is a deep resonance between Professor Singer's moral project and Buddhist aspiration for liberation, nirvana, both of which take suffering with utmost seriousness. So with your kind permission, I would like to offer a few reflections from a Buddhist perspective regarding your speech today and also your work in general, and inviting our Buddhist audience here to consider, to pondering upon. I present them in a spirit of respect and collegial dialogue, hoping to complete Professor Singer's important insights. To begin, I wish to acknowledge how profoundly I agree with the central moral impulse of Professor Singer's work, to reduce preventable suffering whatever we can. This is consonant with the Buddha's diagnosis of the human condition and his therapeutic path. Buddhist texts speak of karuna, compassion for all sentient beings, and encourage the elimination of unnecessary harm. There is also an intriguing affinity between animal liberation and the Buddhist version of liberation from afflictions that bind us. If we understand liberation as the cessation or minimization of needless suffering, we stand on shared ground. That said, Buddhism's ethic framework might not be equivalent to utilitarianism. Buddhism does share a consequentialist concern in its doctrine of karma. Actions that harm others will inevitably return upon the agent, shaping future experience. Yet karma is not mere tally of pains and pleasures. It certainly concerns intention, cetana, and the cultivation of mind. The karmic path is transformative. It invites us to purify motivations, to reduce greed, hatred, and delusion, and to stabilize wholesome qualities. Thus, while both utilitarianism and Buddhism care about consequences, Buddhist ethics is not only about producing the best aggregate outcome. It is also about reshaping the moral agent who acts. A third point concerns the nature of suffering. In Buddhism, dukkha, suffering, includes bodily and emotional pain, but it also names the pervasive dissatisfaction that arises when our expectations conflict with the impermanent and contingent character of reality. Much suffering is therefore interpretive and subjective. This poses a methodological question for utilitarianism, I think. Can suffering be measured objectively enough to support calculations that compare and aggregate it across persons and species? Buddhism cautions that the most stubborn forms of suffering arise from craving and ignorance, embedded in how our mind construes experience. This subject-dependent character of dukkha, of suffering, makes it difficult to treat suffering as a unitary magnitude that can be straightforwardly summed and traded off. Fourth, Buddhist ethics is inseparable from cultivation, from shoshin, bhavana. The ethical path is not only about choosing rightly in particular cases. It is about becoming a person whose dispositions are spontaneously compassionate, patient, generous, and wise. In practical terms, this means that Buddhist ethics is pedagogical. It trains perception, emotion, and habit so that compassionate action becomes natural and rather than calculative. Utilitarianism offers a powerful decision procedure, but perhaps it does not by itself aim to educate the heart. From a Buddhist angle, the inner work of transformation is essential to any durable reduction of suffering, because untrained minds will reliably recreate it, even when trying to do good. Fifth, Buddhism maintains that our own well-being is inseparable from the well-being of others. Helping others refines and liberate the helper's mind. Harming others entangles the agent more deeply in suffering. This leads to a general question for Professor Singer. Does utilitarianism coverage with this view that in caring for others, we also secure our own flourishing, or does it remain primarily an impartial calculus that brackets the question of the agent's transformation? Buddhism suggests that self-interest and altruism ultimately coincide when understood in light of interdependence, and that ethical practice should foster this insight. Finally, let me add a close cultural reflection that colleagues in Taiwan will recognize. A common Chinese maxim says, 长痛不如短痛. A better short pants than long pants. In everyday reasoning, this proverb is sometimes invoked to justify allowing a brief but intense suffering so as to avoid prolonged lesser pain. It raises an important question for any consequentialist ethic. How precisely should we compare intensity and duration of suffering? Is a moment of extreme agony worse than a decade of moderate distress? And under what conditions? Utilitarianism often models this as a function of intensity multiplied by duration, but real lives complicate this. Memory, anticipation, and meaning all shape how suffering is born. A Buddhist perspective would add both intensity and duration matter. Yet the deeper task is to uproot mental causes, craving and ignorance, that magnify both. I would be grateful to hear Professor Singer weigh these trade-offs in hard cases involving humans and animals. Allow me to close by situating ethics within the broader Buddhist path. Ethical conduct, shila, 就是戒, is indispensable, but it is not final aim. It establishes the conditions for meditative stability, samadhi, 戒定, and liberating insight, 慧. Without insight into the root of suffering, ignorance, 无明, our efforts, though laudable efforts, our ethical efforts, remains incomplete. The canonical phrase, Nibbanam Paramam Sukham, Nirvana is the highest happiness, reminds us that the goal is not only to mitigate suffering, but to transcend it by seeing things as they truly are. Professor Tseng, thank you once again for your extremely moral leadership and for challenging us to expand our circle of concern. From a Buddhist side, I hope these reflections are received in the spirit in which they are offered, with respect, gratitude, and a desire for deeper conversation. If utilitarianism's commitment to impartial welfare and Buddhism's path of inner cultivation can be placed in dialogue, we might together approach a more comprehensive version of the ethical life, one that unites effects action with transformation of the heart. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Teng, for a very Buddhist as well as very personal reflection. We will now transition to open discussion, where we will have a chance for a casual conversation, not just among the speakers, but also with the audience. This session will be moderated by Professor Li Yuzhen. She's the director of the Graduate Institute of Religious Studies at National Zhengzhi University. We will wait just a moment as our volunteers set the stage. So thank you to our volunteers. Let's welcome our honored guests to the stage. And Professor Li, the time is yours.
Good morning, everyone. I would like to share a story. Actually, several weeks ago, I invited a very successful CEO to my religion class to teach carbon emissions. Yeah, you are right. All religious groups need to pay tax for carbon emissions. But it turned out that the technological talk turned to be very religious. Because the CEO shared why his business became so successful, because they developed a model of calculation. Everything could be calculated. Food, water, climate change, everything. You can think about resource, everything, right? But then he found out the time when disaster actually enter the world can be calculated. And he told us, if all human beings did not do anything, we didn't participate to stop this kind of terrible thing happened, our world will be end. Our world will be in ruin in 10 years. Only in 10 years. So you can see how emergency this issue should be discussed more carefully, and everyone have a right to participate in. Thank you. Now I will open the field. Would you like to answer their question first, or should I collect?
I'd be happy to respond to the speakers. Same spirit of respect and gratitude for learning. Thank you. I will be pleased to respond to speakers with the same spirit of gratitude and respect for learning that was shown. Maybe I will first respond to Professor Weijen Teng, who asked some very deep questions directly related to what I want to say. So I think I'll try to be brief because I know we don't have a lot of time. You did ask one of the really difficult questions for utilitarians about the comparison, how we can measure suffering and whether we can compare suffering and aggregate it across persons and across species. I think this is certainly a difficult thing to do, but at least between persons, there are some steps forward that have been taken, including in medical ethics, particularly relating to the allocation of scarce resources. In other words, if you have a national healthcare system using public funds, where do you put the money? And we have developed means of trying to assess the number of quality-adjusted life years that are saved by resources in particular areas. So this is done by surveying people on their views to compare life with certain burdens or disabilities, such as being confined to bed, unable to walk, and asking how they would compare a longer life with that condition and a shorter life without that condition. So this gives us a sense of a discount rate for example, being confined to bed. If someone says, well, if I were to choose between living 10 years confined to bed or only 5 years, but with a normal life, that would be the level where I find the choice difficult. But if it was 10 years confined to bed as against 2 years of a normal life, I would take the 10 years confined to bed. If it was 10 years confined to bed against 8 years of a normal life, I would take the 8 years. So we can get people's own preferences, and that gives us some measure. It's not perfect, some measure, in a way in which we can adjust and measure how to compare suffering and longer life. So I think we have to try to do that, even if it's hard. It's of course even harder when we're trying to move across species, because we can't ask questions of the other animals. So we can only make estimates. And some philosophers have been trying to do that. I'd recommend the work of Bob Fisher, who has a book about comparing welfare across species, but it's certainly not an easy thing to do. I'd also like to respond to the question about whether utilitarians, like Buddhists, hold that our own well-being is inseparable from the well-being for others. He said, in caring for others, on the Buddhist view, we secure our own flourishing. Well, I think part of what I was saying suggests that can happen, yes. I think Henry Spira, as I said, felt that. Charles Bressler felt that. But there are people with different conceptions of flourishing, and the question is, are they wrong? Can we persuade them if they think that they're flourishing when they earn a lot of money and then they buy those brands that I mentioned and they live in a penthouse apartment with wonderful views and they have yachts that they can cruise the oceans with? They may not be doing much for others, but at least they think that they're flourishing. And can we prove them wrong is, I think, the really difficult question. I'd like rather briefly to also comment on what Professor Guo-Fang said. And I must say I've had the pleasure of traveling to Weijen with Venerable Chao Wei and seeing the wonderful hospital and hearing about the methods for obtaining bodies for anatomy. And I applaud Tzu Chi for having done that. I also, I do want to raise a question though, which will be a little bit more controversial, I know, but just on Saturday at the symposium that we had at Chung University, there was a paper given by Professor Elise DeVito in which she talked about a Buddhist university that uses animal experiments. And we know she was talking about Tzu Chi University. And raised the question whether indeed a Buddhist university should be killing animals to do research. Now, I see this as a really difficult question. I think any utilitarian would, and because it, of course, the research can benefit humans, and there is this difference there. But one thing that Professor Guo-Fang said actually made me think about, in a critical way, about something that Dr. Delvito quoted from the defense of the use of animals, because you said, I think correctly, that although it was claimed in the anatomy school at Padua that death delights to help the living, but of course the executed criminals whose bodies were used had no consent. Now, Delvito quoted an official of Tzu Chi University as saying that the animals sacrificed are bodhisattvas who are sacrificing themselves for the lives of others. But again, one has to say, the animals did not give their consent, right? They could not will that they were doing this as a bodhisattva would willingly and freely choose to sacrifice their life to help others. So I would hope that Tzu Chi University would think about trying to take a leadership position in moving away from using animals. Not that this could be done necessarily overnight, but there are many alternatives now developing for the use of animals, and they could be used to reduce at least the number of experiments on animals. I want to mention one program which Professor Guo-Fang, perhaps you would take to some of your colleagues, because there is a hospital there, and as you said in your talk, there are people who are terminally ill. Now, at the University of California at San Diego, they are developing a program called The Last Gift, where they invite terminally ill people to participate in medical research. Not only medical research on their own disease, but medical research of other kinds, which may help us to learn how, for example, drugs are metabolized in the body, something that we might otherwise use animal models. But while that would not be a reasonable thing to ask a healthy human volunteer to do, because the risks would be too great, they might lose 20, 30, 40 years of life, to ask somebody who is terminally ill to do that, both to help medical research and to reduce animal suffering, might be a reasonable thing to do, because they in any case will have only perhaps weeks or months to live. So I'd invite you to consider this Last Gift program and offer this opportunity to terminally ill patients in your own hospital. Because the studies from the University of California at San Diego suggest that for many terminally ill people, this is actually a positive opportunity. It gives more meaning to their last days or weeks of life because they know that they can be helping others. Just as the donors of the bodies you mentioned, you use their anatomy, also believe that they can get more meaning because they will be helping others. So I would ask you to consider this as another way of reducing the need to use animals in research. Thank you.
And do you have any more questions? Yeah, please, yeah.
Okay, Professor Singer and his, your effort and insight to offer an objective, impartial method, so to avoid subjective, interpretive argument, and I think that's not very effective, right? So Buddhism too doesn't claim to provide clear, method or theory, principle, ethics, which the scholars regard Buddhism more not a deontological standpoint, but more a virtual ethics. So through cultivation, not providing it is through cultivation and providing a way of path, for example, the Eight Noble Path, and through which we learn how to impartially not only treat others, help others, but also simultaneously transform ourselves.
I would like to respond a little bit, but I'm not that much a philosopher, more medical educationer. Okay. First, as far as I know, Tzu University is an ordinary university. It's not a Buddhist university. It's an ordinary medical school, centered university established by a Buddhist charity foundation. Okay, but it's not a Buddhist university, so there's probably a little bit of a misunderstanding. And the second I would like to say is that about animal studies, okay, it's definitely arguable, but the Taiwanese government has very tight regulations on every university on using animals for research, okay? There are 3 R's, okay? The first is reducing the possibility of using animal for research, reducing the number of animals, and also reducing the suffering of the animal, okay? Any grant, you want to apply for any grant, you have to meet those 3 standards. There's a panel evaluating on the necessity of the, procedures, etc. That's as far as I know. And nowadays, many switch from away from animal research by using cell culture cell, cancer cell culture, etc. Those are definitely one direction. But from a biologist trained as a medical educator or biologist, any kind of research, at the end, you have to try to evaluate back to, if it's taking care of people, you have to, go back to people, okay? But nowadays, people believe that before we can apply to people, we apply on animals, okay, to better serve people. But of course, this is ethnocentric in a way that people think that they are more important than other animals in this world. But this is a big issue, not what I can resolve. For instance, when we are sick, we get infected by bacteria. We take antibiotics. We kill bacteria. Okay? When you are sick with virus, you take medicine that kill the virus. Okay? That's the way, nature, works. So the way of living an ethical life, in my view, is that at the moment of the technology and everything, my view is to be considerate to all other well-beings, okay? To be considerate to the planet Earth, for instance, the moderator talked about carbon emissions and everything. So we should reduce our desire, okay, as much as possible, and try to be considerate to others and to better serve, all other people. And finally, Professor Singer talked about the example in California about terminal ill patients. They willed sort of themselves or their bodies for medical research, sort of, okay? In Taiwan, as far as I know, this is probably very, very difficult at the moment. It cannot be determined by Tzu Chi University, okay? Because the government controls this, okay? This is ethical problem, okay? The 健保署健保局不会同意这种东西。They dare not agree on this because, you know, there will be other people arguing about this. So I think it's good in a way that if we are considerate to others, when we are in such situation, we can offer our body or our medical situation to benefit others. But whether this can be run as an experiment, I think it's very trivial in medical practice, as far as I know. Okay, this would be my comments. Yes.
Well, thank you for that comment. Let me just say, change, it may be that difficult to do in Taiwan, but change will only happen if some practitioners and researchers in the field stand up and suggest it. I think that's the most that I would ask you and others at Tzu Chi University to do.
May I ask a question? Professor Singer, according to my memory, when you gave the keynote speech, you refer animals to sensual beings. I was very astonished. In Taiwan, we know the number of households with pets is already higher than the household with children. So our relationship with pets, our partner, our company, everything is changing. But sensual being is a very Buddhist term. It means even animals, you reborn in the form of animals, you are equal to all human beings because we are all sensual beings. So I'm kind of curious why you use this term.
You're asking why I use the term sentient being?
Yeah.
Well, because I think that, you know, I started off with a slide of Derek Parfit saying that if some being is in agony, we have a reason to prevent that agony. But to experience agony, one must be a sentient being, right? One must be conscious. I use the term sentient being as equivalent to a being who is conscious, who has states of awareness, a subjective experience, and can feel things. And I think it's very clear that all vertebrates are sentient beings in this sense, and some invertebrates. There's some evidence, for example, about octopus and some crustaceans, like lobsters. I would have to say I don't think that bacteria or viruses are sentient beings, but I do think that you know, the boundary is not absolutely clear, but there's a possibility that all animals or nearly all animals are sentient beings. So to me, that marks a morally important divide.
Is very Buddhist. Okay, let's open the field. 1, 2, 3. Okay, please, Professor Liu. We will collect 3 questions and then.
Hello. Okay. Hi. I have a lot of questions for Professor Singers. Of course, I know I can only ask 1 or 2. First thing first. As the wild animal protection become mainstream view, and there's a problem that you know, wild animals population outpace human beings. What should we do? You know, for example, in Taiwan, more and more monkeys jump into human communities, and you know, they steal our food and so on. I want to know your suggestions. And second question, if I can ask two questions. Second question may be a little bit controversial or impolite. Okay. Do you still eat oysters? I'm sorry. And why or why not? Okay, thank you.
Okay, I will answer those questions just briefly. I agree that there are problems about protecting wild animals. You have monkeys. I live in Melbourne and I try to grow some tomatoes and some fruit. We have a problem with possums. They come and eat them. So I have to net the trees. If I don't put nets over the trees, then the possums will eat the fruit or tomatoes before I get them. But you know, I think there are things we can do short of killing these other animals. I know some people would say we should just kill them, but I think we have to try to live with them as best we can. And there may be some additional expense to doing that, but I would like to minimize the conflicts. We can't completely avoid the conflicts, I know, but we can try to minimize them. Well, your question about oysters goes back exactly to a moderator's question about sentient beings. I said, I think almost all animals are sentient beings. But I think oysters are not sentient beings. That's partly because of this rudimentary nature of their nervous system, and partly because oysters cannot really move away from pain. You know, most animals are able to move. Oysters anchor themselves to a rock. And so we have to ask, would it have helped the survival of oysters to develop a sense of capacity to feel pain? I mean, that's how evolution works. We have animals who can move have a capacity to feel pain because pain is a danger and they can move away from it. But oysters can't do that. So, I think it's not that I regularly eat oysters. I can't remember actually when I last ate an oyster, some years ago maybe. But I don't think there's anything objectionable about eating oysters if people want to do that.
Thank you. The second question, please be briefly.
Hello? Yeah, first of all, I'd like to ask Professor Peter Singers about the recent event in Hualien, especially the shovel Superman. You know, because of Taiwan, a lot of volunteers, after seeing the disaster in Hualien, spending a lot of their time, their money, they prepare their own tour, and to do that, if utilitarian talking about effectiveness matters, do you think such kind of volunteerism to helping the people over there, although it's not effective, to utilitarian, is it really matters? Do you think it's plausible? This is number one. This number two question about the sentient beings. When you're talking about oyster, or maybe Professor Tseng talking about the bacterium virus, you know, some people say they are not sentinel beings. And especially Tzu Chi University thinks it's unavoidable. You need to kill them using bioethics. But how do you judge effectiveness by short-term or long-term? If you do some of the long-term measure, then once you leave the ecosystem have a time to rescue you. For instance, bacteria and the virus, you may not to have to kill them. You just increase yourself immune, then you can be recovered. So there are many things I agree with Dr. Peter Singers. Change need to be done by who want to change that for a better life. Thank you.
Thank you. So on the first question, I should say I'm not really well informed about the work that volunteers did in Hualien. But in general, yes, it's important that the work should be effective. I don't think, just the act of volunteering, it maybe shows a positive spirit, but I think it should be directed towards effectively reducing suffering or helping to promote well-being. And if it's not, then I would rather encourage the volunteers to find an activity by which they can do that. Because after all, there are unfortunately many problems in the world that can use volunteer assistance. So I think it is important that one volunteers to do things that are effective. I'm not sure that I fully understood your second question. You asked how we can judge effectiveness, whether it's long-term or not. Obviously, as we think about the long-term effects of our actions, you know, it's like throwing a stone in a pond and the ripples spread outwards. It becomes less certain what the consequences of our actions will be, but we must make estimates of the probability that we are going to be improving well-being or not. That's the best answer that I can give you. I hope that addresses what you were asking.
Thank you. The last question will be from Professor Ng. I think you know him already.
Thank you so much, Professor Tseng. Well, this is a very inspiring and actually very touching presentation for me. And when I see all the examples cited, well, I'm really moved. Thank you for the great presentation. But I do have some academic question for you, and hope you can clarify. And we all know that you take a utilitarian ethical standpoint. My question is about whether the distinction between rules and act utilitarianism. Now, in practice, in your real-world work, do you operate more like a rule utilitarian or an act utilitarian? If rule-based, how do you generate, calibrate, and update rules and handle possible conflicts expectation, for example, between spending money in animal welfare and spending money in anti-poverty goals, as you really matters in your 1970s publication on hunger, all right, poverty. And if act-based, what shared and workable criteria or criterion and evidence standards do you rely upon? For example, compatibility of suffering, uncertainty, and externalities. If I may, a related question is the relationship between reasons and compassion, as Master Zhao Wei has mentioned in her work. And Weijen, Professor Teng, also mentioned about the importance of spiritual cultivation in the tradition of Buddhism. But how do you see reason and compassion working together? From a Buddhist standpoint, sustainable cultivation, spiritual cultivation, can build new moral habits. So people can reliably act to reduce suffering without recomputing every time, without doing logical or reasonable rational cultivation effort each time. So how do you evaluate such cultivation within your framework, aligned with impartialities and welfare maximization, and avoid empathy bias? Thank you. These are my two questions.
Thank you, Professor Ng. Those are very good questions. So briefly on the act and rule question, at the theoretical level, I am an act utilitarian, not a rule utilitarian. For those not familiar with this distinction, rule utilitarians think that you should follow the rule if everybody following the rule would produce best consequences. You should follow it even if in your particular individual circumstances you will not produce best consequences by following it. Whereas act utilitarians say you should consider the consequences of your individual act and not follow a rule. So as I said, I am at a theoretical level an act utilitarian, but it's quite possible for an act utilitarian to say that widely accepted moral rules are usually a good guide to the right action. So, for example, if somebody were to ask me a question, let's say I'm in my home city and somebody is asking me the way to the nearest train station, I will just tell, and I know the way to the nearest train station, I will of course just tell them the truth. I will not try to calculate the consequences of whether it would be best to tell them or not. You know, it's conceivable that maybe they're going to the train station because they want to murder somebody, but it's very unlikely. So I just follow the rule, you tell people the truth when they ask you questions. You don't steal, you don't harm people, all of those rules are almost always the right thing to do. But on the other hand, I will break the rule if, for example, I know that the person wanting to go to the train station is actually planning to murder somebody. I mean, that seems obvious to me, but the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, who was not a utilitarian at all, said no, even in those circumstances, you must not lie to the murderer. So that seems to me to be quite wrong. So that's the sort of middle position that I hold. And thank you for raising the question about cultivation, which gives me an opportunity to respond to something that Professor Teng said that I did not take the time to respond to. I think there's not a great deal of difference between utilitarians and Buddhists on this. I think utilitarians would also like to cultivate people morally, to be more altruistic, to think about the consequences for everyone. In a sense, that's what I've been trying to do in my work. I've been writing to try to persuade people to live an ethical life, and that living an ethical life involves, for example, helping people in extreme poverty and helping non-human animals. So I want to do that too. But on the specific question of whether we should spend more time helping people or donate our money to charities helping people or donate it to charities helping animals, that's, you know, I don't have a clear answer to that. That gets to the difficult problem of comparing the kinds of suffering across species. And I tell people to do what they feel most concerned about, or perhaps to do a bit of both. And personally, I do both. I donate both to charities that are effectively helping non-human animals, and I donate to charities helping people in extreme poverty. I can't give you a better answer to that question. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Singer and Professor Tseng and Professor Teng, and all of you who offer interesting and important questions. Here I will announce this forum will be finished in time. Okay, this is a wonderful chance to meet each other of you and to get very great lessons. Okay, thank you very much.
Big thank you to our panel for stimulating discussion. And please remain on the stage for a group photo. We also like to invite Venerable Zhao Hui to join the panel for the photo. Okay, we now ask the panel to return to your seat for a big group photo with all participants. We want to thank all speakers and everyone in the audience for today's very valuable discussion. We hope the symposium has encouraged everyone to do more in our lives to increase compassion and reduce suffering in this world. Thank you again for being part of this very special lecture today. Please remember to take your belongings with you, and if you have a translation receiver, please also return it to where you got it from. On behalf of Tzu Chi Foundation, we wish you a wonderful rest of the day, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.